After the fighting, after the war, after the bombs, many retreated to the safety of the vaults to wait out the destruction of the old world. But for some, waiting wasn't enough. For the residents of Vault 76 would not remain patiently underground. They would return to the Wasteland's surface and reclaim it. What unknown adventure would they discover? What unknown horror would they face? Would they work together or prey upon each other? The only thing for certain was that an entirely new world awaited them. Fallout 76 is a first-person shooter / survival game. Unlike previous games in this series, you don't play as a lone survivor wandering the wastes in search of redemption. Instead, this time around you play as one of many trigger-happy vault dwellers who have been ejected into the wasteland in order to reclaim it in the name of American exceptionalism. As the game begins, you and possibly several other new players find yourselves in the middle of the rolling hills of post-apocalyptic Appalachia. Now, for the most part, gameplay is identical to the previous game in the series, Fallout 4. You will spend most of your time in the wasteland scavenging for supplies, collecting new weapons, fighting enemies, and exploring the environment. As you travel to new locations, you'll unlock quests and side missions, which can be completed to either progress the story or to reward you with new supplies and materials. Completing these challenges and defeating enemies will also reward you with experience, which you can then use to upgrade your character. Now, as mentioned before, much of the game is similar to the previous entry in the series, Fallout 4. For starters, the combat, both first and third person, is the same. The crafting system has been ported over, with most of the same weapon, armor, and food items still available, although there have been some new inclusions as well. And both the interface and the menus are largely unchanged. However, 76 also includes a number of new alterations and additions. For starters, there's the new environment of West Virginia, complete with its own unique monsters and mutants for you to encounter. There's also a new survival system in place. This was an optional system in previous entries, but is now part of the base game. Essentially, as you explore, you'll also need to eat, drink, and sleep in order to maintain your stats, which, as it happens, have also been modified. This time around, instead of picking permanent bonuses as you would in most other RPGs that have a leveling element, in 76, what happens is you instead pick a perk that you then equip to your character. And what makes it unique is that later on, you can then go back and equip different perks to your character, allowing you to essentially change your stats on the fly depending upon the situation. Now, one of the big new changes is how the game handles building and construction. In Fallout 4, there were specific locations scattered around the map where you could build houses, turrets, crafting stations, even entire settlements, provided you had the time and resources. These settlements would then remain a permanent part of your game even if you left the area. In 76, while there are still buildable locations scattered around the map, they're all focused on resource gathering, and any houses or farms that you construct at these locations will disappear as soon as you log out. To offset this, the game provides you with a mobile camp, which is essentially a portable device that allows you to establish a settlement location pretty much anywhere on the map that you want, provided that it is not too close to another key area. This camp is basically your own mini settlement. You can build a house, you can build crafting stations, you can set up your stash box where you can keep all your extra gear and loot, and anything you build in the area will remain even after you leave. The restriction being that you can only have one camp at a time, and if you try to build a new one in a new area, your old camp gets disassembled. However, thankfully, all the items you constructed are not destroyed, they're just packed away, and you can easily rebuild them in the new area if you so wish. But probably the biggest and most obvious alteration is the inclusion of always online multiplayer. Basically, you and a couple dozen other people will be all running around and exploring the wasteland at the same time. As part of this, you now have the option to team up with other players and try and tackle challenges together, or once you reach high enough level, try and fight other players in PvP. The game even borrows some massive multiplayer style mechanics to encourage this. There are, for instance, limited time events where all the players in a specific area can work together in order to receive rewards. There are also combat challenges and powerful raid bosses that will attract all the players on a server into a massive battle. Now, what's the good and bad of Fallout 76? Well, that's a long and complicated answer, so buckle up. For starters, I like the presentation of the game. I think that it looks good, I think that it's got some great atmosphere, all of the buildings and locations are wonderfully detailed. There's also a great variety of monsters and mutants to encounter as you wander around. Sound design is also good, both in terms of general effects as well as a fantastic selection of old country tunes that you can get over the radio. And the combat system, like Fallout 4, I found very satisfying as well. There's a wide variety of weapons to pick up. They all feel like they have the appropriate weight and power, and both movement and aiming feel appropriately responsive. At the same time, there's also a lot of stuff that I don't like. For instance, I'm not a huge fan of how the crafting system is now tied to loot drops. Essentially, in order to get new recipes, you either need to buy them from vendors or get them as rewards for completing quests. And the consequence of this is that you wind up with a very uneven inventory as you play. It is not uncommon to pick up a new weapon or a piece of armor and not be able to modify it in any way because the game hasn't given you any recipes for it. Here's a good example. I am level 50 and I still cannot make 10mm pistols. And these are one of the most basic weapons in the entire game. If I find one, oh sure, I can customize it as much as I want, but I just never picked up the recipe, so I have no idea how to actually make them myself. I also have some issues with the camp system. On one hand, I appreciate the ability to drop a crafting station pretty much wherever you want, but at the same time, I do think there are some problems with placement. For starters, the game doesn't always give you good information on where you can and cannot position your camp. Also, it's kind of irritating to have to constantly be replacing your structures after they've been packed up, and it's a double irritation that you have to pay to move your camp in the first place. The cost of moving your camp from one location to the next can actually be prohibitively expensive in the early parts of the game. Now, sure, by the time you reach level 50, you're going to be swimming in caps, so you're not even going to notice paying a few to move it around. but that only serves to make it feel like an even more arbitrary tax in the early levels. But probably the most explicit complaint I could make is just the buggy nature of the game. Even in its current state, you're going to encounter some weird stuff. And normally, I wouldn't even bother bringing this up. You know, every game's going to have one or two bugs that slip through the cracks of quality control, but Fallout 76 is buggy even for a Bethesda game. Here's a good example. This is an enemy that spawned without any clothes on. And also no head. So I don't even know what the most disturbing thing about this is. And then there's the multiplayer, which is hard to comment on because of how oddly incidental it winds up being. Oh sure, if you have a crew, exploring the wasteland together can be a lot of fun, except that the game is still structured around mostly solitary activities, like crafting or inventory management or base building. And even quests still need to be completed on an individual level. Plus, the map is so large, you typically won't even notice other players are nearby, and multiplayer interactions like PvP are entirely optional. I would often go hours in-game without even seeing another player, and I would only ever deliberately seek them out when somebody triggered one of the raid bosses. And I gotta admit, at launch, I felt a profound sense of meh for Fallout 76. Because it was clear that Bethesda had made a beautiful, if buggy, mess. They had crafted an open-world, multiplayer survival game, and yet, for whatever reason, had used a single-player template to make it. Which means that you get this wonderfully vast, open world, primed for exploration, where nothing of consequence happens. All of the quests get handed out by robots, all of the events and raid bosses respawn every few hours, and all of your progression is tied to random loot drops. With the assumption presumably being that multiplayer would fill in all the cracks. Except that, as mentioned before, most of the multiplayer is entirely optional. And then, the promised content pack that added an entire single-player campaign to the game, Wastelanders, finally dropped. And the difference is notable. Because with the addition of a single-player campaign, 76 has undergone a subtle transition from multiplayer Fallout game to Fallout game that also includes multiplayer. And that might not sound like a big difference, but trust me, it's important, because a single-player campaign is something a lot like sound mixing or volumetric lighting, an element that you wouldn't consider crucial until somebody removes it, at which point it's all that you can think about. But anyway, the inclusion of Wastelanders makes a huge difference on multiple levels. For starters, it adds a lot of new content to the game. New dungeons, new quests, new enemies and equipment. It also increases the interactivity of the game. There are now towns with merchants who you can barter and trade with, as well as factions and a corresponding reputation system. And in addition to all the new NPCs that got added to the game, there are now dialogue trees as well. You can ask people for more information, you can take on quests, you can even use your special stats to persuade or intimidate or trick people into giving you what you want, which means that there's finally an incentive to create specific character builds. But most of all, Wastelanders adds some much needed context and consequence to the game. In the base game, it didn't matter how many nukes you launched or scorch beasts you killed, the Appalachian servers would repopulate everything inside of 30 minutes. But now, with the single-player campaign, there are choices that matter. NPCs can be killed, factions can be aggrieved, and there are even optional romance side quests. Even if all of these choices are locked to your individual account, having these choices in the first place makes a huge difference. It helps to give the game structure. It helps to give your character an arc. I cannot tell you what a relief it was, after hours of chasing text messages and voice recordings, to finally come face to face with Grandma Overseer herself. Small interactions, even artificial ones like this, go a long way to help give a boundless game like 76 some actual narrative structure. Anyway, all of that was just me trying to explain that Wastelanders is the update that finally makes 76 feel like a legitimate Fallout game. But here's the penultimate verdict. I actually like the game quite a lot, especially with the most recent update. This is a game that provides around 75%, give or take plus or minus 1%, of exactly what I want and exactly what I expect out of a Fallout title. It has a gigantic open world full of all manner of unique locations and explorable dungeons. It's got a ton of dangerous monsters, as well as a huge variety of weapons and equipment recipes to collect. And it's got a great collection of interesting NPCs and quest lines to complete. However, it does also have a weird structure and pacing, a lot of which is made to incorporate the multiplayer content. And also, as mentioned before, it does have a fair number of bugs as well. Haha, take that, beast! Die! Die! And wait, why is the fight not over? Oh crap! Oh, I killed him, but now I have to fight his no-clipping ghost as well. What horror is this? In the end, I'd give Fallout 76 3 out of 4 stars, but giving it a recommendation is a little tricky. Like I said before, it does give you most of what you'd want out of a Fallout game, but it is kinda still a mess. With the addition of Wastelanders, the game can now be played as a full single-player experience, but that doesn't mean that all the multiplayer content and complications went away. At launch, I probably would have recommended this game only to the most enthusiastic fans of the Fallout series, and that's probably still my recommendation today. It is a fun, open-world survival experience, but the game is just as much of a mutant as any of the creatures you're going to meet in the Wasteland. Alright, well, thanks for listening. Don't let the rads get you down. I'll see you next time.